The night wind swept through the dusty streets of the frontier town, carrying with it the sound of a creaking sign above the shuttered general store and the faint whistle of a train fading somewhere far out on the prairie. The town was quiet, too quiet for a place built on hope and struggle, but the quiet had a weight to it, as if something was waiting to happen. At the edge of that silence stood a young woman, her small bag of belongings resting by her worn shoes, her dress tugged by the restless breeze. She had been left there on the steps of the depot after the last train pulled away. Nobody had stepped forward. Nobody had called her name. No one came to claim her. She lifted her chin as if refusing to let the loneliness show, though her eyes betrayed the truth. She had traveled a long way with nothing but a letter of promise folded carefully inside her pocket. A letter written by a man who was supposed to meet her, a man who had spoken of a future, of a place to belong, of a home. Yet the train had left, the platform had emptied, and only she remained. The promise had turned hollow, and the cold boards beneath her feet seemed to whisper that she had been forgotten. The town was no stranger to stories like hers. People came west chasing love, fortune, or freedom, and many were left with nothing but dust and disappointment. But she was not the kind to collapse in despair. She sat on her bag, waiting, hoping, though the lamps in the depot dimmed and the last of the station hands tipped his hat and locked the door for the night. By then, she was just another figure the town might overlook, another soul swallowed by the vast silence of the plains. What she did not know was that another set of eyes had noticed her. From across the street, a man leaned against the post of his office porch, his hat brim low, his badge catching a faint glint from the lantern light. The widowed sheriff had seen strangers come and go, but something about her kept his gaze longer than he expected. He was a man burdened by loss, by years of holding together a town that always seemed one argument away from breaking apart, and by the shadow of a house that felt too empty since his wife's passing. He told himself he had no room for curiosity, no room for the weight of another life, yet he could not look away. She sat straight-backed, as though she had been taught not to show weakness, but the slump in her shoulders gave her away. The sheriff knew the look of someone abandoned. He had seen it too many times in the eyes of drifters, of boys who lost their fathers to the war, of wives whose men never came back from the mines. But there was also something different in her, something stubborn, something unyielding, the kind of quiet strength that drew respect, even in silence. The moon climbed higher, silvering the rooftops, and still she waited. At last, she pulled the folded letter from her pocket, running her fingers over the words as though they could still be trusted. The sheriff could almost see the tremble in her hands from where he stood. He shifted, uneasy, telling himself it was none of his concern. Yet he knew the town. He knew what it did to those left alone, with no roof, no kin, no name to anchor them. And he knew the kind of men who would notice her if she stayed on that platform much longer. He turned back toward his office, willing himself to let her be. But just as he reached the door, her voice carried faintly through the night. A whispered prayer, or perhaps just words meant for herself, words that made him pause with his hand on the latch. In that moment he remembered the hollow quiet of his own nights, the silence of a house that once held laughter. Something within him shifted, though he did not yet know why. Across the street, she lowered her head, her thoughts tangled in fear and determination. Should she stay until morning and risk being seen as unwanted? Should she walk into town alone, with no direction but the shadows of the street lamps? Or should she climb aboard the next train heading anywhere but here, leaving behind the dream that had brought her west? Her heart raced at each thought, her chest tightening as the emptiness of the prairie pressed around her. The sheriff's boots echoed as he stepped down from the porch, his stride slow, deliberate. He wasn't sure what he would say when he reached her, wasn't even sure why he was crossing the street. But with each step, the silence of the night seemed to deepen, as if the town itself was waiting to see what would happen. She lifted her head at the sound of his boots, her eyes catching his shadow in the lamplight. For an instant their gazes locked, neither willing to speak first. The weight of that moment stretched between them, charged with something neither could name. The sheriff stopped a few paces away, his hand resting on the edge of his belt. He studied her carefully, the way her hands gripped the folded letter, the way she braced herself as though expecting to be turned away again. The words formed in his throat, but did not yet leave his lips. She swallowed, clutching her bag closer, uncertain whether to trust the stranger who stood before her. His badge shone faintly, a sign of duty, but also of power, and she had learned long ago that both could wound as easily as protect. Still, there was something steady in his presence, something that eased the trembling she tried so hard to hide. The air grew heavier, the night colder. The sheriff shifted, his voice low, careful, but carrying enough weight to break the silence at last. And just as he spoke, the sound of approaching hooves broke through the stillness, cutting across the night like a warning. Both turned their heads toward the dark end of the street where riders emerged, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. The sheriff's jaw tightened, his hand brushing against the worn handle of the revolver at his side. The young woman's breath caught in her throat, her grip tightening on the bag in her lap. Whatever promise the sheriff's words might have held was swallowed by the sight of the riders drawing nearer, their presence stirring a chill deeper than the wind. The sheriff took a slow step forward, placing himself between her and the approaching figures, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that told her the night was far from over. She held her breath, her heart pounding as the riders closed in. Whatever had begun in silence was about to be tested, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, that her story in this town was only just beginning. Would the sheriff shield her, or would the riders claim what no one else had dared to? The answer hung in the air, unspoken, as the sound of hooves grew louder and the night waited on the edge of revelation. The riders slowed as they neared the depot, their horses snorting clouds into the chill night air. The sheriff stood firm, his boots planted wide, his hands steady near the grip of his revolver, but not yet drawing it. He knew this town too well, knew the trouble that came after dark, and he also knew how quickly a stranger could be swallowed whole by the wrong kind of men. The young woman's heart thumped in her chest as she clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles pale in the dim light. She did not know who these men were, only that their presence turned the air heavier, the silence sharper. The riders did not speak at first. They reined their horses to a halt, dust swirling around their boots as they sat high in their saddles, eyes glinting in the glow of the lantern above the depot door. The sheriff recognized one of them, a ranch hand, with a habit of drinking too much and running his mouth even more. The others were harder to read, but he didn't need their names to understand the kind of men they were. He had seen their type in every town from here to the border, men who looked for weakness and preyed on it. "Evening, Sheriff," one of them finally called, his voice drawn out, carrying a tone that felt less like greeting and more like testing. The sheriff gave a slow nod, his jaw tight, eyes steady. "Evening." Their gazes shifted toward the woman on the platform, and a smirk played across one of their faces. "Seems like someone's been left behind." "Strange thing, a lady sitting alone out here at this hour." The young woman stiffened, lowering her eyes as though that might make her invisible. But she knew she had been seen, and the weight of their attention pressed on her like a hand against her back. She could not help but wonder if this was how her story would end, claimed not by the man who promised her a future, but by strangers who saw her as nothing more than a passing amusement. The sheriff's stance shifted, a subtle move but enough to send a message. She's not alone. The riders exchanged glances, the smirk fading into something darker, something edged with challenge. Yet for all their swagger, they did not press forward. The sheriff's presence was too steady, his reputation too known in this town. After a moment, one of them spat into the dust, tugged his reins, and the group began to turn their horses. Their silence as they rode away was louder than words, carrying a promise that this was not the end of it. When the last of their hoofbeats faded into the distance, the night seemed to exhale. The sheriff finally let his hand fall from his revolver, though his eyes lingered on the road long after the men were gone. The woman's voice was soft when she spoke, almost unsure if she should. "Were they going to take me?" The sheriff turned his gaze back to her, and though his face was hard, there was no harshness in his tone.
"Oh."
"They were thinking about it. Men like that don't think far beyond what they can take." Her fingers pressed against the letter still in her pocket. The words that had brought her across miles of land seemed foolish now, a fragile dream scattered by the hoofbeats of strangers. "The man who was supposed to meet me, he never came." The sheriff studied her, his brow furrowed. "You came here expecting someone." She nodded. "A man who wrote to me. He said there'd be a place for me here, that I wouldn't be alone." Her voice wavered. But she caught herself and straightened again, unwilling to let tears fall in front of him. "But he wasn't at the station. I don't know where he is. I don't even know if he ever was here." The sheriff didn't answer right away. He had heard of such letters before. Promises written by men who wanted wives or workers or sometimes just someone to own. Not all of them were honest. He studied her a moment longer, then asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated, almost as though speaking it aloud would make her too real, too vulnerable. But at last she said it, her voice clear but quiet. The sheriff repeated it under his breath as though testing the sound, then nodded. "You can't stay out here," he said. "Not tonight." Her eyes lifted to his, searching for the meaning behind his words. "Where am I supposed to go?" He glanced toward his office, then past it to the dark outline of his home on the edge of town. He hadn't brought anyone into that house since his wife's passing, hadn't even opened the rooms that still carried her scent. That something in him told him he couldn't leave this woman out in the cold, not with men like those riders circling the edges of the night. "You'll have a room," he said simply, though the decision weighed heavily in his chest. Now, she looked at him, uncertain whether to trust the offer. But she had little choice, and something in his steady voice carried a promise she wanted to believe in. She gathered her bag, rose from the platform, and followed as he led her away from the depot. The walk through the sleeping town was quiet, each step echoing against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. She took in the shapes of the buildings, the saloon with its swinging doors shut tight, the blacksmith shop dark and still, the church steeple reaching against the star-scattered sky. It was a small town, weathered but alive, and she wondered what stories it held, what secrets it whispered behind closed doors. The sheriff said little as they walked, but his presence beside her felt like a shield against the night. His stride was even, his shoulders squared, and she noticed how every sound, every rustle of wind, every creak of wood seemed to meet his attention. He was a man who carried the weight of watching, of guarding. When they reached his home, he pushed open the gate and led her up the steps. The house was simple, but solid, the kind built to withstand storms both of weather and of life. Inside, the air held the faint scent of cedar and smoke, and she caught the shadow of framed photographs on the mantel, though he quickly moved past them as if to keep them from her eyes. He showed her a small room upstairs, the bed neatly made, though clearly unused for a long time. She placed her bag at the foot of it and turned to him, uncertain how to thank him for something that felt more like mercy than kindness. "You'll be safe here," he said, his voice carrying finality. "We'll talk in the morning." With that, he left her, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he descended. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded around the letter once again. The ink had begun to smudge from the many times she had clutched it, and she wondered if she had been a fool to ever believe it. But then she thought of the sheriff, of the way he had stood in front of her at the depot, the way he had faced down the riders without flinching. Perhaps the letter had brought her here for reasons she did not yet understand. Downstairs, the sheriff sat at his table, his head bowed into his hands. He had not expected this night to bring a stranger into his life, nor had he expected the ache in his chest that returned with her presence. It stirred memories he had long buried of promises he had once made to a woman who no longer walked this earth. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, but did not drink it, staring instead at the dark window where the night pressed close. He knew those riders would not let the matter rest. Trouble was circling, and with it came questions he did not yet have answers for. The town, quiet under the weight of stars, seemed to hold its breath. Upstairs, the young woman lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. And downstairs, the sheriff sat alone, his mind turning over the choices of the night, knowing that both their lives had just been set on a course neither of them could yet see. Outside, in the distance, the faint sound of hooves stirred again, a reminder that the danger had not passed. It had only just begun. The morning came slow, lights spilling over the prairie in soft streaks of gold and red. The town stirred awake with the clatter of wagons on the main road and the distant hammer of the blacksmith at his forge. The sheriff was already up, sitting at his table with a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in his hand. His eyes were heavy, not from lack of sleep alone, but from the weight of thoughts that pressed through the night. Upstairs, he could hear the soft tread of the young woman moving about, careful not to disturb the house too much, as if she already knew she was stepping inside a life she wasn't meant to touch. When she finally came down the stairs, she looked different in the daylight. The weariness of the train ride and the fear of the night before still lingered in her eyes, but the morning light revealed a quiet determination beneath it all. She glanced around the room, noticing the sheriff's few possessions books stacked unevenly. A rifle propped against the corner, the photographs on the mantel he had tried to keep from her view. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Thank you for letting me stay." The sheriff gave a short nod, his jaw tightening. "You couldn't stay at the depot? That's no place for anyone at night." She sat at the edge of the table, her hands folded together, the folded letter tucked neatly back into her pocket. "I don't want to trouble you. I don't know where else to go." Her words struck him harder than he expected. Trouble was already circling the town, and taking her in meant tying himself closer to it. Yet there was something in the way she spoke, calm, careful, but filled with the kind of honesty he had nearly forgotten existed. "You're not trouble," he said finally. "But the men from last night, they'll see you as an opportunity. That kind of attention doesn't fade." Her gaze lowered. "So what am I supposed to do?" The sheriff didn't answer right away. He thought of the town, of the saloon where men like those riders wasted away their nights, of the ranches scattered across the land where workers lived hard and died harder, of the church where folks came seeking hope, but rarely found more than gossip. The town was not kind to outsiders. And yet here she was, dropped into the middle of it all by a promise that may never have been real. By mid-morning, word had spread. Folks in town noticed she hadn't left with the next train, noticed that she had spent the night under the sheriff's roof. Whispers carried fast in a place where news was scarce, and before long, shopkeepers, ranch hands, and even the preacher's wife were exchanging knowing looks. Some said she must be a runaway bride. Others claimed she was sent for by a man too cowardly to claim her. A few even suggested she might not be who she seemed at all. The sheriff knew how fast a rumor could turn into a noose in a town like this. The young woman felt the eyes on her when she stepped out onto the street later that day. She kept her head high, though inside she trembled. Children peered at her from behind corners, and women muttered into their bonnets as she passed. She wanted to shout that she was not some secret, not some shameful story meant to be picked apart by strangers, but she said nothing, only held her bag tighter and kept walking. At the saloon, the riders from the night before leaned against the rail, watching her with lazy grins that carried too much intent. They made no move toward her, not while the sheriff was in sight across the road, but their eyes followed her every step. One of them muttered something under his breath, loud enough for the others to laugh. She quickened her pace. The sheriff noticed. He was standing on the porch of his office, pretending to sort through papers, though his gaze never left her. He could feel the tension building like a storm. The riders weren't going to let it rest, not with their pride bruised by the way he had stood against them. Trouble was coming, and she was caught in the middle of it. Later that afternoon, she asked the sheriff a question that caught him off guard. "Why did you help me?" He looked at her, surprised by the bluntness of her tone. He thought of all the reasons he could give, none of them simple. Finally, he said, "Because no one else did." She studied him, as if trying to see beyond the badge and the silence. She wanted to understand what kind of man he was, what pain lived behind the lines in his face. But the sheriff was not one to give away more than a few words at a time. Still, that answer was enough to stir something inside her, something she didn't yet have a name for. As evening fell, a different kind of unease spread across the town. A cattleman rode in from the south, carrying word of fences cut and stock driven off under the cover of night. It wasn't the first time trouble had touched the land, but the sheriff knew the pattern raiders moving through, testing the edges of law and order. He also knew men like the riders from the saloon sometimes tied themselves to bigger schemes, and the thought of it made his jaw tighten. The young woman overheard some of the talk from townsfolk gathering in clusters outside the saloon. Her stomach sank. She didn't know much about the ways of ranches or cattle, but she understood enough to see that the town was unsettled, restless, and hungry for someone to blame. One of the ranch wives caught her eye and gave her a look that stung deeper than words. It was the look of someone who had already decided she didn't belong. The young woman carried that look with her as she returned to the sheriff's house, where the shadows stretched long across the floorboards, and silence sat heavy in the corners. Upstairs, she unfolded the letter again, staring at the words that had brought her here. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, but now she noticed things she hadn't before, the lack of detail about his life. The way the promises were broad but empty. A part of her wondered if the man had ever been real at all, or if she had been chasing a lie written by a hand that never intended to follow through. The thought burned in her chest, but she pressed the letter back into her pocket. If she admitted it was a lie, she would have nothing left but the emptiness of her own mistake. The sheriff, meanwhile, sat in his office late into the night, sorting through reports. Listening to the shifting sounds of the town outside, thought of her, of the way she looked at him with a mixture of fear and trust, of the way her presence stirred old memories he had long buried. Didn't want to admit it, but her being under his roof was changing something inside him, something he wasn't ready to face. The riders hadn't shown themselves that night, but he knew better than to think they were gone. He knew men like them, always circling, waiting, building courage in numbers and drink. The question wasn't if they would return, but when. When they did, he had no doubt they would come with more than words. As the town settled into uneasy slumber, the young woman lay awake in the small room upstairs. The sound of the wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied sharply before silence fell again. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, her heart heavy with fear and confusion. She had thought the hardest part of her journey was over once she stepped off the train. But now she understood that stepping into this town had only placed her at the beginning of something far more dangerous. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Each time she drifted, the memory of hooves in the night returned, pulling her awake again. And each time she wondered if tomorrow would bring answers or if it would bring the trouble that had been circling ever closer. Outside, the moon cast long shadows across the empty street. The lantern swayed faintly in the wind, and from the dark edge of town, the faint echo of horses stirred again, drawing near. The night carried the sound to those who listened closely. And though most of the town slept, one man and one woman remained awake, caught in the same silence, waiting for what would come. The sound of horses grew clearer in the darkness, carrying with it the weight of something unwelcome. The sheriff sat by the window of his office, his hand resting near his revolver, his eyes trained on the empty street. The lantern outside flickered against the wind, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every movement. He had been waiting for this, knowing the riders wouldn't let the matter rest. They had been circling like wolves, and now it felt like they were ready to close in. Across the street, the young woman lay in the small room upstairs, her eyes open in the dark. She had heard it too, the steady rhythm of hooves on the hard earth, growing louder, pressing into the silence. She pressed the blanket closer around her, her heart racing as though it already knew what was coming. The letter in her pocket felt heavier than ever, no longer a promise but a burden she carried without knowing why. The first rider came into view, his horse moving at a slow walk, followed by two others. Silhouettes shifted in the lantern light, their hats low, their shoulders squared. They didn't rush, they wanted to be seen, to let the sheriff know they were there, to send a message without speaking a word. More followed from the edge of town, until the soft earth trembled beneath the weight of hooves. The sheriff stood, stepped onto the porch, and let the cool night air hit his face. His hand stayed close to his revolver, though he didn't draw. His voice carried sharp and steady when he called out. "That's far enough." The men reined their horses, dust rising around them. One of them, the same rider who had spoken at the depot, leaned forward in the saddle, his grin faint but clear, even in the dim light. "Evening again, Sheriff. Didn't mean to wake the town. We're just passing through." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You've been passing through every night this week? State your business?" The rider chuckled. "Business? We're just men with time on our hands. But maybe we came to see how your new guest is doing." "A woman left alone like that, well, she deserves some company, doesn't she?" A ripple of laughter moved through the group, low and mean. Upstairs, she caught every word. Her breath came fast, and she gripped the edge of the blanket, her knuckles white. She had known the riders were dangerous, but hearing them speak of her so openly, like she was nothing more than a prize, filled her with fear sharper than any train ride or empty promise. The sheriff stepped down from the porch, boots crunching against the earth. His voice cut clean through the night. "She's under my roof. That makes her under my protection. You boys would be wise to remember that." The air thickened. Silence pressing between them, broken only by the restless shifting of horses. The riders weren't used to being challenged, not by a man alone. One spat into the dirt, another reached for his canteen, but all of them watched the sheriff with the same burning intent. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the lead rider tipped his hat low, his grin widening. "We'll leave it be for now. But you can't keep her locked away forever, Sheriff. She's not yours. And when the time comes, we'll see who she belongs to." They wheeled their horses and rode off, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. The sheriff didn't move until the sound of hooves faded into the night. Only then did he let out a slow breath, his hand slipping from his revolver. Back inside, the house was still, though he could feel her presence above him, awake and listening. He didn't call out to her. Instead, he sat in the chair by the window, his eyes fixed on the empty street, his mind turning with thoughts he couldn't quiet. The following days were no easier. Word of the writer's late-night visits spread quickly, feeding the town's appetite for gossip. Some whispered that the sheriff had overstepped, that he was protecting a woman he had no claim to. Others said he was finally softening after years of solitude, and that softness would be his undoing. The writers, meanwhile, grew bolder, seen in town during the day, lingering near the saloon, their eyes following her whenever she ventured out. She tried to move with purpose, to hold her head high despite the stares and whispers, but each step felt heavier. The townsfolk's judgment was cutting, but it was the writer's attention that made her stomach twist. They watched her with the same hunger every time, as though waiting for the sheriff to falter so they could close in. One afternoon, as she crossed the street with a small parcel from the general store, one of the riders called out to her from the saloon porch. His voice was mocking, carrying far enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Careful, miss. Don't get too comfortable in the sheriff's house. A man like him, don't keep company for long." The laughter that followed stung worse than the words themselves. She hurried across the street, her cheeks burning, her heart hammering. The sheriff had been watching from his office, and when she reached the steps, his jaw was clenched, his eyes hard. "You don't have to walk out alone," he said, his tone steady, but carrying a sharp edge. She looked up at him, her voice quiet. "I can't hide. If I do, they win before anything's even begun." Her words cut into him. She was right. She had already been abandoned once. To see her hide away now would be a second kind of defeat, one she refused to allow. The sheriff respected her for that, even as it made his own burden heavier. As the days passed, tension coiled tighter in the town. Ranchers rode in with more complaints, cattle missing, fences cut, supplies stolen. The sheriff knew the riders were tied to it, but proving it was another matter. They were careful, leaving no trace, building fear with every move. The town was on edge, and fear made people reckless. One evening, the preacher came to the sheriff's office, his voice low, his eyes darting toward the door. "You're putting the whole town at risk, keeping her here?" "Those men aren't going to stop. They're going to push until something breaks. Maybe it's time you sent her on her way." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "She didn't ask to be left here. Didn't ask for any of this." "Maybe not," the preacher said, "but neither did the rest of us. You've carried this town on your back for years, Sheriff. Don't let one stranger undo it all." When the preacher left, the sheriff sat in silence, the words gnawing at him. He thought of her upstairs, her quiet strength, her determination not to fold under the weight of it all. Sending her away would only feed the riders exactly what they wanted. Keeping her close might tear the town apart. That night, he found her sitting by the window, staring out at the dark road. She didn't turn when he entered, only spoke softly. "They won't stop until they get what they came for, will they?" He stood behind her, his hands resting at his sides.
Ow.
"But they won't find it as easy as they think." Her reflection in the glass showed a flicker of fear, but also a spark of something stronger. "And if they come," the sheriff's voice was low, steady, but filled with something heavier than promise, "then they'll find me waiting." Outside, the town lay quiet, but the silence felt like the moment before thunder. The riders hadn't shown themselves that evening, but the sheriff knew it was only a matter of time. Each day brought them closer, each night pressed heavier. The young woman closed her eyes as she leaned against the window pane, the sound of the wind carrying faint echoes of hooves she couldn't tell were real or imagined. The sheriff stood in the shadows behind her, watching the road, his hand resting near the revolver at his side. And in the distance, just beyond the reach of the town's lantern light, the riders were gathering once more, their laughter carried faintly on the night air, their intent sharp as the edge of a blade. The storm was nearly upon them, and both she and the sheriff knew the next move would decide everything. The night the riders finally came. The air was thick and restless, carrying the kind of silence that warned of something heavy on its way. The sheriff had known it would happen. He had watched the way they lingered, how their stares grew bolder, how whispers spread through town with every passing day. Trouble had been circling too long not to break through at last. The young woman sensed it too. She sat awake in the small upstairs room, her fingers gripping the letter that had once been her hope, but now only felt like a chain. Each hoofbeat she imagined out in the dark made her pulse quicken, until she could no longer tell if she was hearing ghosts of fear or the real sound of men drawing closer. The first crack of laughter cut through the night air, followed by the rhythm of hooves pounding hard against the ground. This time, there was no slow approach, no pretense of casual talk. The riders came fast, their silhouettes breaking from the dark edges of town like shadows on fire. Doors cracked open along the street as townsfolk peeked out, holding their breath as they realized what was happening. The sheriff stepped out onto his porch, his revolver drawn, his hat brim low. He had carried this town on his shoulders for years, and tonight he stood alone again, but for the woman watching from above. The riders reined in at the center of the street, their horses restless, their eyes glinting with the thrill of challenge. The leader's grin stretched wide as he called out, "We warned you, Sheriff, you can't keep her forever. We've come to take what's ours." The sheriff's voice carried steady, hard as the steel he gripped. "She was never yours. She never will be." The street held its breath. The whole town pressed into silence as the two sides squared against each other. The woman above pressed her hand to the window pane, her heart pounding as she whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone would hear. She had run too far, believed in too many false promises. But here was a man standing, not because of what he might gain, but because of what he refused to let be taken. The first shot rang out sharp and sudden, splitting the night wide open. The sheriff moved quick, his revolver flashing, the sound echoing off the wooden buildings as the horses reared and chaos exploded. The riders fired back, dust rising in the street as gunfire cracked through the air. Windows shattered, lanterns swayed, and townsfolk ducked low inside their homes, the battle raging just beyond their doors. The woman could not stay hidden. She rushed down the stairs, her breath caught in her chest, as she reached the edge of the porch. The sheriff was in the street, his form steady, even as bullets kicked up dirt around him. His eyes met hers for just an instant, sharp with warning. "Stay back," called, but his voice carried something more, a plea to hold on, to trust him, to let him carry the fight. The riders pressed hard, circling like wolves, but the sheriff moved with a calm precision born of years in uniform, years of holding a line no one else dared to hold. One by one, his shots found their marks, not killing outright but breaking their charge, driving them back, showing them he would not fall. The leader snarled, his grin twisting into fury as he spurred his horse forward, aiming straight for the sheriff. The two men met in the center of the street, gun against gun, steel against steel, the sound of their struggle ringing sharp. Dust rose around them, the air thick with smoke and sweat, the town's lanterns flickering against the clash. For a moment it seemed the sheriff might falter, outnumbered and pressed too hard, but then the townsfolk stirred. One by one, doors opened wider. Men who had once muttered in doubt, women who had judged in silence, stepped onto the porches, eyes wide with the truth they could no longer ignore. The sheriff wasn't standing only for himself, and not just for the woman they had whispered about. He was standing for the town, for all of them, and against the fear that had choked their streets for too long. The final shot cut through the night, louder than the rest, leaving only the echo behind. The leader of the riders slumped from his saddle, his weapon falling useless into the dirt. The others froze, their bravado drained in an instant, the weight of their defeat clear and the way their horses shifted nervously beneath them. The sheriff stood tall, revolver still steady, his chest rising heavy with breath, his eyes locked on the men who remained. "You're done here," he said, his voice carrying like a hammer striking stone. "Ride out and don't come back." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, without another word, the riders turned their horses and melted back into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by the dark they had come from. The silence that followed was heavier than the fight itself. A silence filled with the sound of a town realizing it had been spared. The sheriff lowered his revolver, the strength in his arm finally giving way as he let the weapon hang at his side. His gaze lifted toward the porch where she stood, trembling but unbroken, her eyes locked on his. In that moment, something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. She had not been claimed, not abandoned again, but protected, seen for who she was, not for what someone else wanted her to be. In the days that followed, the town changed in ways small but sharp. The riders were gone, scattered and silent, their threat broken. The townsfolk who had once whispered now nodded with respect when they passed her on the street. The women who had judged softened their eyes, and the men who had doubted the sheriff's choice now spoke of his stand with pride. The young woman once left forgotten at the depot found herself woven into the life of the town, not because of the letter that had brought her, but because of the strength she had shown when she stayed. The sheriff, though still burdened by the loss he carried, no longer walked with the same hollow weight. His home, once too quiet, held the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the warmth of a lamp lit upstairs, the steady reminder that life still moved forward, even when the past pressed heavy. He didn't speak much of the fight, nor of the night the riders came, but when his gaze met hers, there was a quiet understanding that neither of them had to carry their burdens alone anymore. The letter remained folded in her pocket for a time, a reminder of the journey that had brought her to this place. One evening, as the sun set low over the prairie, she took it from her dress and held it over the lantern flame. The ink curled and blackened, the paper crumbling into ash, and with it went the last tie to promises that were never real. She stood a little taller after that, the smoke drifting away into the open air, leaving only the truth of where she was now. The sheriff watched her from the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, the faintest shadow of a smile on his face. He had given her a room, yes, but more than that, he had given her a reason to stay. And in return, she had given him something he had not thought possible anymore, the chance to believe in tomorrow. The town would remember the night the riders came and the stand that was taken. It would tell it as a story of gunfire and grit, of a sheriff who defended what was right. But beneath the dust and the echoes, it was more than that. It was the story of a woman no one came to claim until she chose to stay, and of a man who had lost everything but found reason again in the quiet strength of another. As the prairie winds swept over the town and the stars scattered across the sky, both of them stood in the doorway of the house that was no longer empty. The night was calm, the kind of calm that comes only after storms. And for the first time, neither of them felt alone.